Hello and welcome to our next lesson, which is over the 20th century and the wars and presidents of the 20th century. I'm standing here at Washington, D.C. at the Vietnam Memorial, and that's a painting portraying the Vietnam Memorial behind me. The 20th century is a unique time period where we see in we see world wars happening, two of them pretty close to each other, and we see kind of this continuous concept of wars and international conflict and fighting over this 100-year span. And so I want to kind of connect the wars that are happening and the US presidents that are in office during those, so we can make those connections when we're reading passages on the GED exam for social studies. Let's get started. 20th century wars. This is a painting by a Spanish painter named Pablo Picasso. Pablo Picasso is a very famous painter known for his cubism and impressionism in Spanish art. And this is a painting called Guernica, where he is portraying the bombing that happened in northern Spain during the Spanish Civil War that was happening right before the precursor of World War II. So we see a lot of these rural images like horse and cattle and bulls. We see advancements of electricity, because again, this is the beginning of the 20th century. So we see candlelight, but we also see electricity next to it. But we also see that light also being like a bomb or an explosion. We see lots of death and destruction. And over here it's cut off, but we see a woman carrying her dead child, a lot of death and destruction, but yet subtle images of hope and peace. Like this gentleman here holding a flower that's still growing upright in his hand, of like that hope that we will get through this. So let's look. These are the major wars that the US was involved in the 20th century. We started in World War I and then World War II. We had the Cold War, which really wasn't a war that we think of with the word war, where there's soldiers fighting in death, but it was more of this political chess match of Russia moved here and the US moved here, and Russia moved here and the US moved here. It was tension, 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 without a lot of fighting and death. But then towards the end of the Cold War, there actually is fighting that is done in the country of Vietnam. That was a pretty deadly war that the US was involved in. And after that, we have the Persian Gulf War in the Middle East, which then leads us to 9/11 and the plane crashes in New York City and the Twin Towers. So let's look at these, but what I would like to do is make connections between the major wars of the 20th century and their presidents. Because when you take the GED exam in social studies, they'll most often give you a speech or a document from a president linked to a war, and by connecting president names and wars, it kind of gives us a little context of what is going on. So let's take a look. At the very beginning, first president I want to talk about is Woodrow Wilson. I remember that Woodrow Wilson is the president in the World War I because of the W's. Woodrow Wilson, WW1. So Woodrow Wilson is World War I, WW. So he was president during World War I. And similar to World War II, the United States stays neutral, meaning they do not get involved with the war at first. If you look at the start date of the war, the World War I started in 1914, but the US doesn't actually join until 1917. That's 3 years into the war, because both of these world wars are happening over in Europe. And most of the fighting and everything is in Europe. The United States is far away on the other side of the ocean, and the United States really tries to keep its distance, to say, no, we're not going to get involved. We don't want people to die. We want to protect our economy and try to avoid it. But eventually, the United States gets sucked into the war. We join the war in 17. At the very end of it, 2 years later, the war is over. The United States leaves that in really kind of this position of power, because the United States was part of the Allies, with the side that won the war. And Woodrow Wilson goes to Paris for the peace conference to sign the treaty ending the war. And at this moment in US history, the United States kind of gets elevated as a little bit of a world power of, wow, the United States have a powerful military, they've participated in this large world war, and they're taking a role in international politics as kind of a leader. This leads to the crazy 1920s of the United States. We see parties and celebrations and dances and jazz music and go-go dancers and champagne on champagne with more champagne. And we see people spending money, often spending more money that they have. We see the banks making really terrible investments, which then leads to the end of the 20s. We have a crash in the stock market in the 1920s, as we saw in our previous video about the stock market crash of 1929. Then we enter the Great Depression in the 1930s, where there's no jobs. Unemployment rate has increased exponentially. The Midwest is suffering from a drought and the Dust Bowl. There's no food, there's no money, there's no jobs. Poverty is increasing. What is going to happen? And towards the end of that, we then have a Second World War on top of it. So the president that I want to talk about is Franklin Roosevelt, who was president from 1933 to 1945. FDR is also what he's known for. FDR was president during World War II and during the Great Depression. He was the president that really focused on jobs and creating jobs for Americans during the Great Depression. Let's build national parks, let's build bridges, let's build dams, let's build, and give job opportunities to Americans. Let's get women into the workforce more. How can we increase the economy of the United States? He was also president at the beginning of World War II. So Woodrow Wilson, again, was that idea of staying neutral. It was like, no, Europe is way over there. We're going to stay here. We're having this economic crisis. We just had a stock market crash. We are going through a drought. Our food supply is really low. We don't have the means or resources to get involved. We're going to stay out of the war as much as possible. But in 1941, the Empire of Japan attacks the United States, really kind of sparking this fire of, at this point, it's now inevitable. The United States has to get involved in World War II. And so that is one big event in history that happens in 1941, is the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Here are images of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was a port city in Hawaii. It was a big naval port with a lot of the Pacific Fleet being stationed in this natural port. And the United States really thought that their ships were really well protected. They did not think that the Japanese would have the capabilities of actually flying in and dropping torpedoes in this shallower harbor. But the Japanese actually worked on a technology with wood to get their torpedoes to kind of float more, to be a little more buoyant. So when their torpedoes would hit the water, they would stay up high enough in the shallow harbor and to be able to hit the boats. And it completely caught the US government and the US military off guard altogether. There is a movie from 2001 with Ben Affleck in it that's all about the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And here's the trailer.
Jim Man, it's 2 o'clock, and Chris goes!
How long is America going to pretend the world is not at war? From Berlin, Rome, and Tokyo, we have been described as a nation of weaklings and playboys who hire British or Russian or Chinese soldiers to do our fighting for us.
I'm going to the war. Just make sure and come back for the both of us, all right?
We've been trained to think we're invincible. But our people think Hitler and his Nazi thugs are Europe's problem. We have to do more. Does anyone think that victory is possible without facing danger? In times like these, we all need to be reminded who we truly are.
Warning of Japanese aggressive movement.
That we will not give up. December 7th, 1941. A date which will live in infamy.
So this movie is about the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and what we were hearing at the very end was one of the most famous speeches from FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, where he talks about the day that will live in infamy. That is an instant key that when you read that quote, you're like, oh, that's FDR referring to the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And so that is that president during World War II. Here, the next war that kind of happens after World War II is the Cold War. And like I was saying, the Cold War is not a war where you see soldiers on the ground fighting with bombs going off. This was a political war against ideas and ideologies. You see two sides. On one side, you see capitalism and a capitalist society, which is about buying and selling of goods and treating people as consumers. That a consumer buys goods and then you sell things back to that consumer. And on the other spectrum, you see this idea of communism, where their main philosophy is this idea of equally spreading resources out to everyone. Capitalist society, it's the more you work, the more money you make. And it is based on this tier of you have a lower class, a middle class, and an upper class. And the more you work, the more advancement you can go up this hierarchy of class. That if you work more, you get more access to resources. Or communism is everyone gets equal. Here are the resources and they get distributed out to everyone equally. And in theory that works if you have a very benevolent leader. But what we see in a lot of these communist countries like China, Russia, Cuba, Venezuela, we see these really militaristic tyrant leaders get in who really kind of want to control everything, similar to like North Korea being communist as well too, that you have this one leader that makes all the decisions and controls everything, and the actual resources that get spread out to everyone are often very small, very minimum, and not enough. So we see this idea of war, this ideological war. The first president during the Cold War is Henry Truman. He's the president during the start of the Cold War, and he starts the anti-communist movement in the United States. In the United States, they were afraid of communism and communists. People were like, oh, if you were identified as a communist, you were often arrested, investigated by the FBI, were thrown into jail, and it was this idea of let's find these communists. These communists are trying to tear down our way of living in this capitalistic society. The next president was Dwight Eisenhower, and Dwight Eisenhower is famous because he was a soldier, a general in World War II, and then becomes president during the Cold War. And then the last president, who is probably the most famous for the Cold War, is John F. Kennedy, JFK. JFK was president in the 60s where a lot of things were developing, and this was kind of the highest tension, especially with Russia, and that's like who you even see in these two images here, is this conflict between the United States and Russia during the Cold War. And JFK is kind of the face of the Cold War. At this time, we have a lot of fear of nuclear weapons. The Cold War was a fear of a nuclear war. Russia had nuclear weapons, the United States had nuclear weapons. Russia's trying to get nuclear weapons down into Cuba. Venezuela was getting nuclear weapons. North Korea was developing a nuclear weapon program. We had all these communist countries that were like, oh, and who is going to use a nuclear weapon first? The United States used a nuclear weapon right at the end of World War II. That kind of ended World War II really quickly and put a kibosh to it. They dropped two nuclear bombs on top of Japan. And since then, countries have developed nuclear weapons, but no one's actually used them. they use them as what's called a deterrent of don't mess with us, we have a nuclear weapon. So you have these armed nations looking at each other with nuclear weapons, and then you have a whole world of people going, what's going to happen? It would be devastating if Russia and the United States shot nuclear weapons at each other at the same time. We're talking about end of civilization as we know it potentially. So there was this like scare of nuclear war and nuclear weapons. Another thing that's happening in this time is the race for space. Both of these countries, the United States and Russia, are kind of competing. Who's a better country? Who's a stronger country? Who's a better nation? And one of their ways of flexing their strength was showing who has the technology to send rockets into space and to get into and to do space travel. So we see this race for space that we see. Who's going to get there first? And the Russians are actually the first ones into space. They successfully get a rocket, shoot it up, and enter and exit the Earth's atmosphere and send a human being out into space first. So that was step one. Step number two then was, can we send people to the moon? And this is where the United States then really put a lot of money and investment into NASA, really worked on developing it, and ended up sending and doing the Apollo missions and actually getting to the moon and landing people on the moon, being the first country to land humans on the moon. So it was this space race. Another movement that's happening during this time with JFK as a president is the civil rights movement. JFK was a really big supporter of this tension that we're seeing in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s of the segregation. We're seeing Black communities and white communities being separated, schools for Black children, schools for white children, and there's really this disparity, this unfairness between them, and that we needed to increase civil rights and treat people equally with equality and equity. And so JFK was one of the presidents that was really supportive of the civil rights movement, was a supporter of JFK. Because of some of the ideologies of JFK, he actually was assassinated. And one of the things that JFK is famous for was being assassinated. He was in an open convertible, as you see in the picture, in a parade. And in the middle of the parade, he was shot and killed inside the convertible. That means the first time that the vice president actually becomes the president for the rest of that term. And so President Johnson becomes President Johnson because of the assassination of JFK. After that, the next big president that's very popular that we'll see sometimes on GED questions is Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was president in the 70s. And he is known for kind of opening up the US market internationally, especially with China. He was the first US president to actually go over and meet with the Chinese government, the People's Republic of China, that has been developing over the 20th century too. During this time, we see the Vietnam War happening. The Vietnam War started in the 50s, and it's this long process. The Vietnam War is kind of the extension of the Cold War. There was this idea of capitalism versus communism. Part of Vietnam is communism, the other part of Vietnam is capitalism. And the United States comes in saying, oh, we need to make sure we protect the capitalists and not let the communists take over. But then countries like Russia were then supporting the communists, and we see this conflict of kind of capitalism versus communism. But what Richard Nixon, I think, is most famous for, I should say infamous for, what he's like known for doing something really bad, is the Watergate scandal. That when he was president and he was running for re-election, he used his powers as president and his influence to do illegal wiretapping and to listen in on the Democrat meetings to see what his opponents were coming up with, what were some of their strategies, what were their, so he could have a leg up, an advantage on the election. And it actually all came about in the news, and the news media got a hold of it, started running papers. They were going to put President Nixon up for impeachment and try to vote him for impeachment. But when that happened, he ends up actually resigning as president. And he's just like, all right, I quit. I quit as president. And so he literally was one of the first US presidents that quits through his term towards the end of it. And so he resigns as president. All right, let's move on to our questions for this class, our GED readings. So first we have two timelines we're going to look at. One was post-World War I and Hitler's rise to power, and the United States enters World War II. So we see our dates, 1915, all the way to 1943. World War I ends, Treaty of Versailles. We see all of these events that are happening in chronological order. Let's read the passage. This timeline illustrates the events that led to Adolf Hitler's rise to Chancellor of Germany. The trend in this timeline connects Germany's loss in World War I to Hitler's role in the Nazi Party, to economic depression and political dissatisfaction, to the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party. So number 7, what directly led to the Nazi Party receiving the most votes in 1932 German elections? So the German unhappiness with other politicians because of the economic crisis, punitive actions towards the Germans by victorious allies at Versailles, the choice of Hitler to lead the Nazi Party, and the end of World War I in 1918. So what directly led to the Nazi Party receiving most votes in 1932? Well, let's look at our timeline. So in 1932, Nazi candidates received the most votes of any party in Germany. Let's see what happens. So we have depression reaches Germany, leading to dissatisfaction of other political parties. Here at 1929, Hitler works to build the Nazi Party throughout Germany. Hitler leads a failed attempt to overthrow the German government. Hitler becomes leader of the Nazi Party in Germany. Let's look at our answers. Germans' unhappiness of other politicians because of economic crisis, punitive actions towards the Germans by victorious allies, the choice of Hitler to lead the Nazi Party, and the end of World War I. I would say our best answer is A. If you said A, you are correct. The German unhappiness with other politicians because of the economic crisis. Because here in 1929, we see depression reaches Germany, leading to dissatisfaction with other political parties. So that idea of other political parties and other politicians, we can make that connection. Number 9, based on the timeline above, how many years was Hitler the leader of the Nazi Party in Germany before he became Chancellor of Germany? See, what year did he become? So here he becomes Chancellor of Germany in 1933. When does he become the leader of the Nazi Party? Well, here it says Hitler becomes leader of the Nazi Party in Germany in 1921. How many years is that? 21. We're going to have to do some math. 33 minus 21. It is, if you said 12 years, your math is correct. If you didn't say 12 years, you should sign up for Michelle's math class. Let's be real. Even if you said 12, you should sign up for Michelle's math class. It's great. All right, next paragraph. The Neutrality Acts were intended to limit American involvement in future wars. In 1935, Neutrality Act became banned weapons exports to hostile nations and restricted American travel on those nations' ships. In 1939, the 1939 Act encouraged support of the Allies, but created product shortages at home. President FDR further eroded neutrality by trading surplus U.S. ships to Britain for access to naval and air bases and providing U.S. military equipment to enemies of Germany and Japan under the Lend-Lease Plan. Congress repealed the Neutrality Act in 1941. So, when did the Lend-Lease Plan take effect? So we're looking for the Lend-Lease Plan. Where do we see it? See, the U.S. Lend-Lease Plan allows Britain to borrow war materials in 1941. So our answer is March of 1941. Why did President Roosevelt introduce the Neutrality Act in 1939? The isolationist movement was growing stronger. Supplying arms to allies helped the U.S. economy. Roosevelt did not run for re-election. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. So why did President Roosevelt introduce the Neutrality Act in 1939? Let's go back up here to 1939. So war breaks out in Europe, the Great Depression, Germany. How about here, 1935? President Roosevelt signs the first Neutrality Act aimed at keeping the United States out of European war and prohibiting the export of arms, ammunitions, and implements of war to foreign nations at war. Why would he do that? The isolationist movement was growing stronger. Supplying arms to allies helped the U.S. economy. Roosevelt did not run for re-election. The Japanese attacked on Pearl Harbor. Well, let's eliminate some of the answers. First off, I know that B cannot be correct because his act clearly said you cannot send weapons or arms to other countries. So we know that can't be right. Roosevelt did not run for re-election. Did we read that? Didn't really mention that in any of the readings, and it didn't mention it in the graph. I would say that one there. Now, the Japanese does attack Pearl Harbor, but that's towards the end when the U.S. joins. Here, the isolationist movement was growing stronger. That was kind of at the beginning. Which one of these would be a better answer? If you said A, you are correct. The isolationist movement was growing stronger in the United States. Again, they didn't want to go to war. They couldn't afford to go to war. It was expensive and dangerous. And they had just finished World War I. All right, here's our next timeline, which is set up a little bit differently. It moves this way from left to right. Notice there's also a top and a bottom. A top is everything that's happening in Europe, and the bottom is everything that's happening in the Pacific. So let's have a look. So we see everything happening in Europe, and we see everything happening in the Pacific. Here. All right. All right, let's read our first question. It says, which of the following gives the dates of parallel events in Europe and the Pacific? So parallel meaning that they're the same type of event. Let's have a look. So first one, September 1939. I see that here. So September 1939, Germany invades Poland, and then February 1942. U.S. launches first attack of the war from aircraft carrier. Are those the same thing? Not really. Let's look at our next ones. May 1945. May 1945. Here it is. Germany surrenders on May 7th. And here we have September 1945. Japan formally surrenders on September 2nd. These both have to do about enemies surrendering. So that could be a possibility. I kind of like that. But let's put a little arrow by it and mark it, but let's check the other ones. Here we have December 1941. So December 1941, it says, in response to U.S. declaration of war against Japan, Germany and Italy declare war on the U.S. And then June 1942, Battle of Midway, U.S. forces destroy all of the Japanese Navy important aircraft carriers. Battle marks the turning point of war in the Pacific. I would say this is kind of like almost towards the end of the turning point, and this is more the beginning. So I would say, nope, those are not the same. And then our next one, April 1945. Here's April 45. So Soviets enter Berlin, Hitler commits suicide. And then August 1945, the US drops atomic bombs in Hiroshima. So here, the Soviets enter Berlin, Hitler commits suicide. Here they're dropping bombs on Hiroshima. I would say our best connection is probably May. Our best parallel connection is, letter B, May 1945 and September 1945. They're right next to each other on the timeline, and here, Germany surrenders on May 7th, Japan formally surrenders. Both of them are about countries surrendering. So our best answer is B. Let's look at 12. Which event on the timeline eventually led to the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? So I saw that, we just read that the US drops atomic bombs. So what comes right before it? So here's our line. We want to look to see what happens before it. So the Germans surrender before it. Hitler committed suicide. The US forces pushes Germany back. Here we had the D-Day invasion in France, and then the battle in Belgium. So here's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in historical order. What happened right before it? So which event on the timeline eventually led to the dropping of the atomic bomb? The successes of D-Day invasion, the Battle of Midway, the launch of the Manhattan Project, or Hitler's death? I would say the closest would be Hitler's death. Because looking at our timeline, Hitler's death is here on April 1945, May, June, July, August. That is 4 months right before the dropping of the atomic bomb. And here, May, June, July, August, 3 months before, in 1945, Germany actually surrenders. So it's kind of Germany surrenders, and then they drop a bomb on Japan. So our best answer is D, Hitler's death. Let's look at 13. Based on the information on the timeline, which of the following statement is true? The Battle of Midway forced Japan to surrender. Germany controlled the Soviet Union. Japan joined the war in defense of Germany. The US Navy was vital in the war against Japan. So let's look at some of these. Battle of Midway forced Japan to surrender. Looking for the Battle of Midway. I'm scanning our text for the Battle of Midway. See here? The Battle of Midway, US forces destroy all Japanese naval important aircraft. Did this force Japan to surrender? Well, 42, Japan didn't surrender until 1945. That's 3 years. Did this event cause them to surrender? I'd probably say no. That wouldn't be a good cause and effect. There's too much time between those two. Let's look at here B. Germany controlled the Soviet Union. Here I see the Soviets entered Berlin, Hitler commits suicide. So if the Soviets are entering Germany in Berlin, I wouldn't say that Germany controlled the Soviets. It looks like the Soviets came in and took over Germany. So again, B, not correct. C, Japan joined the war in defense of Germany. Why did Japan join the war? So here we have Germany invades Poland, France falls to Germany, Battle of Britain begins. So all of this is happening in Europe way before the Japan responds to US protests. And so here, in response to the US declaration of war against Japan, Germany, Italy declare war on the US. And then here, Japan responds to US protests of Japanese aggression in Asia by launching air attacks on the U.S. naval forces of Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. U.S. Congress declares war on Japan. Is there anything here that talks about Japan joining war in defense of Germany? Yeah, not really. So I'm kind of like questioning C. I'm like, I can't really disprove it, but I can't prove it either. Let's look at D. The U.S. Navy was vital in the war against Japan. How often do we see the word U.S. Navy? U.S. Naval Forces, U.S. Forces, Japanese Navy, U.S. Forces, U.S. Forces, U.S. King's Victory. Here, U.S. launches first attack from aircraft carrier, which would be the Navy. So like the U.S. Navy, U.S. Every single one of these says U.S. Forces, U.S. Forces, U.S. Forces, U.S. Forces. Was the U.S. Navy vital during the war against Japan? I would say yes. That is our best answer because I can find a lot more evidence and support for that than I can C. I can't find any support. I can't find anything disproving it, but I also can't find any support for C. So D is our best answer. All right, and then question number 14. On the timeline supports which of the following trends? D-Day was the first major turning point in the war. The Allies attacked territories that Japan and Germany controlled before directly attacking each country. The United States focused all of its attention in 1945 in the Pacific. Japan had a superior air force. Which one does our timeline suggest? Any of them that we can remove right away. Listening to this one here, the United States focused all of its attention in 1945 in the Pacific. I would disagree with that because they were happening in the Pacific and Europe at the same time. So if I look at 1945, U.S. forces go to Germany, U.S. forces. So in 1945, the U.S. is in both places. So I know that one can't be true. So Japan has superior air force. Does this say anything about, so U.S. launches first attack on war from aircraft carrier. Here's a turning point in the war. Nothing about this talks about the Air Force being superior. So again, this is one of those where I can't really find any evidence supporting it, but I can't find any evidence disproving it either. Let's look at A and D. So D-Day was the first major turning point in the war. Where was D-Day? D-Day was, I see it here at the top, June 1944, D-Day invasion in France. But then I said I read turning point here. The turning point of the war was in June 1942. Was D-Day the first major turning point? No, so I know that one can't be true. So I've now eliminated, C, I've eliminated A, D, I can't really find anything, B, the Allies attacked territories that Japan and Germany controlled before directly attacking each country. Let's see. So they attacked places they controlled before attacking that country. Let's look in the Pacific first. So here they attack, the Japan attacks Pearl Harbor and we start the war. The first place the US goes is the Battle of Midway, and they destroyed the Japanese Navy ships at Midway, which is not Japan. Then they go to Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands, which again is not Japan. They then go to the Leyte Gulf. So they're kind of like strategically like here, 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 getting closer and closer. Then they do the Battle of Okinawa actually in Japan. So it was like step 1, step 2, step 3, and then Japan. Let's look at what was happening in Europe. So here Germany invades Poland, response to U.S. declaration of war. U.S. troops arrive in Europe. They start to capture cities in Italy, not Germany. So they go to Italy first. Then they go to France. They go to Belgium. And then they go to Germany. So here's kind of step number 1. They get to Europe. Then they do Italy, France, Belgium, and then finally attack on Germans. So if we look at our question, the Allies attacked territories that Japan and Germany controlled before directly attacking each country. B is our best answer. Very good. All right, our next reading has to do with the space race and how the United States was in this race to get into space. So a brief history of NASA. An act to provide for research into the programs of flight within the outside of Earth's atmosphere and for other purposes. With this simple preamble, the Constitution and the President of the United States created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, on October 1, 1958. NASA's birth was directly related to the pressure of national defense. After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union, which is now Russia, were engaged in the Cold War, a broad contest over the ideologies and allegiances of the non-aligned nations. During this period, space exploration emerged as a major area of contest and became known as the space race, just like we were talking about. During the late 1940s, the Department of Defense pursued research and rocketry and upper atmospheric sciences as a means of assuring American leadership in technology. A major step forward came when President Dwight Eisenhower approved a plan to orbit a scientific satellite as part of the International Geophysical Year, the IGY, for the period of July 1st, 1957 to December 31st, 1958, a cooperative effort to gain scientific data about the Earth. The Soviet Union quickly followed suit, announcing plans to orbit its own satellite. Again, we see this idea of a race, right, of who's going to get there first. The Naval Research Laboratory Project Vanguard was chosen on 9 September 1955 to support the IGY effort, largely because it did not interfere with the high-priority ballistic missile development programs. It used the non-military Viking rocket as its basis, while an Army proposal to use the Redstone ballistic missile as the launch vehicle waited in the wings. Project Vanguard enjoyed the exceptional publicity throughout the second half of the 1950s and all of 1956, but the technology demands upon the program were too great and the funding levels too small to ensure successes. Full-scale crisis resulted on October 4th, 1957, when the Soviets launched Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite, as its IGY entry. This had a Pearl Harbor effect on American public opinion, creating an illusion of a technological gap and providing the impetus for increased spending for aerospace endeavors, technological and scientific educational programs, and the chartering of new federal agencies to manage air and space research and development. All right, let's look at our questions. Number 7. Which of the following conclusions can you draw based on the information? NASA was created for the primary purpose of defending the nation's borders. Sputnik gathered scientific data about Earth to be shared with the international community. NASA is the world's premier agency in space exploration. The general public plays a major role in deciding which government agencies receive the most funding and support. All right, looking at these questions, let's see if there's any we can eliminate as definitely not a correct answer. The first one that I see is A, the nation's borders. They were looking at space travel, which has nothing to do with land borders of the countries. So A is definitely not. Then we have NASA is the world's premier agency in space exploration. It was the first agency. Was it the first agency? No. Our article said otherwise. So one thing that's really important about reading texts for the GED exam is really looking at chronological order. Authors will often tell you about something that happened in time. Like here, it mentions, oh, that NASA was created in 1958. So since this is the first thing the author tells us, we think, oh, this is the first thing that happens in time, but it's not true. Now that the author told us about NASA, the author is going to say, but wait, let me go back in time and show you how we got here. So NASA was created in 1958, but then the author goes back to tell us about what was going on in the 1940s, 1957, 1958, and how in the 1940s and then 1955, these other countries had developed what they had in 1957. So by 1957, the Soviets had launched their rocket into space, which then sparks the creation of NASA in 1958. So was NASA the premier or the first? No. Other countries were looking at space travel, including Russia, way before the United States were. Russia was already in space and successful with the rocket before the US government decided to actually create NASA. So now that we've reread the passage, we know that NASA was not for the nation's borders. We know that NASA was not the first because the Sputnik happened way beforehand. So that leaves the Sputnik. That leaves us B and D. Which one is the better answer? We have Sputnik gathered scientific data about Earth to be shared with the international community, or the general public plays a major role in deciding which government agencies receive the most funding and support. B could be correct and D could be correct. Which one does the author mention? Let's relook at that last paragraph. Does the author mention that the Sputnik was used for international science? So it says the full-scale crisis resulted on October 4th, 1957, when the Soviet launched Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite, as its IGY entry. This had a Pearl Harbor effect on the American public opinion. So here they're talking about public opinion, creating an illusion of the technology gap, providing the impetus for increased spending for aerospace endeavors, technology, and scientific education. So here, the American people were like, wow, this was almost as significant as Pearl Harbor. Another country has advanced us in technological advancement. We need to do something about it. So how did the US government respond? Well, the US government responded by the next year in 1958 by creating the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, also known as NASA. So our best answer is D. The general public plays a major role in deciding which government agencies receive the most funding and support. All right, and then our last reading that we're going to look at today is about the Watergate scandal with President Nixon. So a congressional hearing about the Watergate break-in scandal during Richard M. Nixon's presidency revealed that the president had installed a tape recording device in the Oval Office. The special prosecutor in charge of the case wanted access to these tape discussions to help prove that President Nixon and his aides had abused their power and broken the law. The president's incomplete compliance was challenged and eventually taken to the U.S. Supreme Court. The following excerpt is from the court's opinion written by Chief Justice Warren Burger. So this is what he said. Neither the doctrine of separation of powers nor the need for confidentiality of high-level communications without more can sustain an absolute, unqualified presidential privilege of immunity from judicial process under all circumstances. The president needs to be complete candor and objectivity from advisors calls for great deference from the courts. However, when the privilege depends solely on the broad, undifferentiated claim of public interest and the confidentiality of such conversations, a confrontation which other values arise, absent a claim of need to protect military, diplomatic, and sensitive national security secrets, we find it difficult to accept the argument that even the very important intersect and confidentiality of presidential communications is significantly diminished by production of such material for in-camera inspection with all the protection that a district court would be obliged to provide. So again, the GED exam isn't expecting us to know every single one of these words that the Supreme Court Justice is talking about. We're just trying to capture the big picture. So we already know President Nixon. We know Watergate. We know he resigned because that's our background knowledge. So what is the Supreme Court probably saying here? Let's look at our questions. How does Chief Justice Burger support the Supreme Court's opinion? He provides statistical justification. He offers examples that show it to be correct. He explains the legal reasoning behind the court's decision. He describes similar cases in other nations. Well, one, let's eliminate some of our answers. I did not hear him describe any other nations. And I didn't hear any statistics. I didn't hear numbers, 25%, 3 out of 4, every 42. So that means he either gave us examples or he gave us legal reasoning. What did he provide? Examples or legal reasoning? Let's look back again. Neither the doctrine of separation of power nor the need for confidentiality of high-level communications without more can sustain an absolute unqualified president privilege of immunity from judicial process under all circumstances. From judicial process. When I see that word, when I see judicial, that means courts in my mind. Process, so the process of the courts. And since this is the Supreme Court, I would assume they're talking about the judicial process, the actual legal process of the courts. So I would say our correct answer is explain the legal reasoning behind the court's decision, C. The argument also would be relevant in which of these situations? A boundary dispute between two communities, a contested election, a debate about free speech, the governor's refusal to turn over material for an investigation. So again, let's see, we have to think critically. We're talking about the President of the United States, because it's Richard Nixon. We know he used his presidential power to sneak in recordings. We know that he resigned, so he felt that he was guilty or thought he would be convicted of being guilty. Which of these situations is most like that? A boundary issue between two communities, a contest election, debate for free speech, or a governor's refusal to turn over materials for an investigation? If you said D, you are correct. They're making a connection between a president of the United States and a governor of a state. And that the president of the United States having these recordings would be just like other materials that a governor would have, that the courts are saying, hey, you need to give us these so we could look at them for the purpose of an investigation. All right, and that ends our lesson today over the 20th century wars and the presidents that were there during these wars. I will see you next time.